On August 15th, 1914, a luncheon for 7 people became their last meal. They were locked in the dining room, the house was set on fire, and those who jumped from the windows were met with an axe. Among the dead was the architect's mistress and her 2 young children. This was the home of America's greatest genius, his personal paradise built on a hill. He named it Shining Brow. Today, it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Thousands of people pay to see its harmony and light. But what if I told you this massacre was no accident? That the house itself, its corridors and layout, were designed as a perfect trap. And in this trap, the first to die was not the one it was intended for. A Wisconsin morning smells of wet grass and order. The air is clean, almost sterile. Here, in the heart of America, the land is flat and people speak softly. They arrive on buses to see a dream frozen in stone. They are led along carefully measured paths. In their hands, cameras. In their ears, the steady, almost soporific voice of a guide, listing dates, names, architectural terms, organic architecture, harmony with nature, unity of form and function, words polished to a shine, like the handrails in this house museum. They photograph the fireplaces, 37 of them, the horizontal roof lines that embrace the hill, as if afraid to let it go, windows like long, pensive sighs. They see the genius, they see the legacy, but step away from the group. Listen. Through the monotonous narration, another sound breaks through. The barely audible creak of floorboards under an unseen weight. The rustle of wind in the treetops, like a whisper. The building is silent, but its silence is deafening. He named it Taliesin, Shining Brow in the language of forgotten Welsh kings, a name for a prophet, for a bard. But if you get closer to the stone itself, you can see that this brow is scarred. Here, a deep crack in the limestone, like a healed knife wound, and here, under the eaves of the south wing, soot ingrained so deeply into the pores of the wood that neither solvent nor time can wash it away. This is not dirt. This is the indelible memory of fire. The guide speaks of light, of space, of how the architect manipulated emotions, compressing corridors, and then releasing you into sun-drenched living rooms. But he doesn't speak of the darkness that gathers in the corners, of rooms where the air feels thicker, as if holding a final breath. This place breathes cold even on the hottest afternoon, the cold of limestone that remembers not only the master's chisel, but also the killer's shadow. Every great house holds secrets. It's a cliché they sell to tourists. But what if this house is not just the scene of the crime? What if its walls, its corridors, its very geometry are not witnesses, but accomplices? What if this building was designed as a perfect trap, a labyrinth for other people's souls, in which the creator himself became lost? Look over there, at the dining room window. The sun hits the glass, turning it into a blind mirror. But if you look long enough, for a split second, at the edge of imagination, a silhouette appears. A woman. She is not looking at you. She is looking inside, at the set table, where on one hot August day in 1914, lunch became the last supper. 7 people, an axe and a flame. The tourists take one last photo and head for the exit, carrying postcards and brochures. They take away the story of a genius. But we will stay. We will stay to read a different story, an architectural autobiography, written not only in ink, but in blood. Because Taliesin is not a monument, it is a tombstone disguised as a manifesto. Chicago, the early 20th century, a city built on bull sinew and pig fat, reeking of coal and boundless greed. Here, the air vibrated with the roar of trains and the clang of hammers erecting the steel skeletons of skyscrapers. In this city of sharp lines and even sharper morals, Frank Lloyd Wright was not just an architect. He was a snake charmer in an expensive suit. His voice, quiet and confident, could make bankers and steel magnates believe that a house was not just a box to live in, but an extension of their own soul. A soul they never even suspected they had. One day, a man named Edwin Cheney came to him, a substantial man with a solid bank account and a young, beautiful wife. He wanted a house, modern, a work of art. He came to the genius for prestige, writing a check for his own humiliation. Wright took the commission. He would come to their house, unrolling blueprints on the table that looked like maps to a new world. He spoke to them of unity, of breaking down walls. But while breaking down the walls of the house, he was also breaking down the walls of another man's marriage. His fingers, long and artistic, glided across the paper, but his gaze was on her, on Mamah Cheney. She was not just a client's wife. She was an intellectual, a translator, a woman suffocating in the corset of Oak Park propriety. In the architect's words about the freedom of space, she heard the promise of a different, personal freedom. Designing the house became their secret language. The fireplace, he would say, is the heart of the home. But he was building this hearth to warm another man's wife by its fire. An open floor plan, he explained to the husband, creates a sense of spaciousness. But what it really created was a space where a casual touch, a stolen glance, could not hide from the eyes they were meant for. Edwin Cheney paid for every sketch, for every brick, financing the architecture of his own cuckolding. This money, smelling of deceit and a quiet man's pain, became the first down payment on the foundation of a future Eden. But there was another source of funding, a quiet one, smelling of old paper and camphor. Far from the construction sites, Wright led a second, shadow life. He was obsessed with Japanese ukiyo-e woodblock prints, a world of floating women with porcelain faces, kabuki actors in frozen masks of rage, landscapes where Mount Fuji watched the world's turmoil with icy calm. This was not merely a collector's hobby. It was a cold, calculated business. He bought them in Japan, where the ancient world was being sold off for pennies to Europeans and Americans who didn't understand the true price of fleeting beauty. And then he brought them here, to Chicago, where the nouveau riche were desperate to acquire a taste of the exotic and the artistic. He sold them these thin sheets of rice paper with a markup of 400, sometimes 500%. He was selling them someone else's soul, wrapped in silk, to build his own. Every print sold to a wealthy industrialist turned into an acre of land in Wisconsin. Every geisha from a Hokusai block paid for a bag of cement. This is how the capital for a paradise on earth was assembled. It was woven from adultery paid for by a deceived husband and a commercial savvy that exploited a dying culture. Every dollar that went to buy the land in his ancestors' valley carried this original sin. The foundation for the shining brow was laid on the unhappiness of others. And from the very beginning, that foundation was doomed to crack. When the scandal broke, it was like the smell of gas in a sealed room, invisible but suffocating. Chicago, a city that forgave theft and murder, could not forgive public adultery. Wright, who had abandoned his wife and 6 children, and Mamah Cheney, who had left her husband and their new home, a home he himself had built, became pariahs. Their names were hissed from the pages of newspapers. They were scorned from the pulpits. A society built on hypocrisy demanded blood for their candor. And so he fled, not just from the city, but from the era itself. He returned to the land of his ancestors, to a valley in Wisconsin, where the hills were as gentle as the backs of sleeping beasts, and time flowed more slowly. Here, on land bought with the money of shame and resold beauty, he decided to build not a house, but an answer, a challenge, a manifesto carved in stone. The construction of Taliesin began as an act of pure, unadulterated egoism. This was not architecture for people. It was architecture against them. He was building a fortress, but one without battlements or high walls. Its defense was the land itself. He did not place the house on the crest of the hill, as anyone else would have, to dominate the landscape. No, he allowed the house to embrace the slope, to become its extension, to grow out of it like an ancient rock formation. Not on the hill, but of the hill, he would say. This was his credo. The building was not meant to scream of its greatness. It was meant to merge with eternity, to become invulnerable to the judgments of petty, bustling people. We see him on the construction site, not in a white collar, but in dusty boots. His figure, a nervous, tense silhouette against the backdrop of the forests. He didn't trust blueprints. He trusted only his hands, his eye. He personally selected every stone from the nearby quarry, rejecting those that seemed deceitful to him in their color or texture. He would gaze at the yellow limestone, pitted with the traces of ancient mollusks, and see not a building material, but the very flesh of this land. He wanted to build a house that was not just a building, but a geological formation. He shouted at the workers. His voice, usually smooth and persuasive, would break into a shriek. He made them rebuild walls if the stonework didn't seem musical enough to him. He was obsessed. This was not a job. It was the ritual of creating a world, his world, and in this world, he was a god, a demiurge, controlling every aspect of existence. He made the ceilings in the hallways deliberately low, oppressive. They forced you to instinctively hunch over, to feel insignificant. And then, upon entering the living room, you would find yourself in a space where the ceiling soared upwards and the walls dissolved into windows. This wasn't hospitality. It was manipulation. He dictated what you were to feel. He was an architect not only of walls, but of your emotions. The fireplaces. There were 37 of them, in every wing, in every important room. Massive, built of rough-hewn stone, they resembled pagan altars. He called them the hearts of the house. But these were not hearths of comfort. They were the centers of his new universe, around which the lives of the inhabitants were meant to revolve. He, like Prometheus, had brought fire into his own man-made world. And the entrance to this Eden was hidden. No grand porticos, no majestic staircases. To get inside, one had to walk along a low stone wall, turn a corner, and climb a few inconspicuous steps. You didn't enter Taliesin, you seeped into it. Access to the sanctuary had to be earned. It was a filter, cutting off the world of the profane. Only the chosen were admitted here, those who understood and accepted his law. My genius is above your morality, these walls screamed. Your petty rules do not apply here. Taliesin was the material embodiment of his megalomania. He hadn't built a refuge from the world. He had built a world meant to replace the one that had rejected him. And in the center of this world, on a throne of stone and wood, sat he, the architect, the master, a lonely god in his newly created, frighteningly quiet paradise. And so, Taliesin was finished. The stones had settled, the wood had dried and begun to breathe. The first few years were like an exhale after a long run. Inside these low, earth-hugging walls, Wright and Mamah Cheney tried to build not just a life, but a new model of existence. By day, it was a temple of thought. The sun, passing through long ribbons of windows, flooded the studio with light, where on the tables lay not only blueprints for new, unimaginable buildings, but also manuscripts. Mamah, freed from the shackles of a suburban housewife, threw herself into her work. She was translating the works of the Swedish feminist Ellen Key, whose ideas about free love and female self-realization were pure heresy for the time. Every translated word, every polished phrase was more than just an intellectual exercise. It was a justification for their own rebellion. They were turning their scandalous elopement into a philosophical act. Taliesin became an intellectual salon in the wilderness, an oasis of free thought in the middle of a puritanical desert. In the evening, the house transformed. The flames in the fireplaces cast deep, living shadows on the stone walls. They dined by candlelight, and the flickering firelight played across the right-designed furniture, the Japanese screens, and her face. In those hours, the house became a sanctuary, a cocoon woven from stone and silence, protecting two outcasts from a hostile world. Here, inside, they were not sinners. They were the first people in their own Eden, an Adam and Eve after the exile, who decided to build a better paradise. But paradise was under siege. Beyond the estate's walls, there was no silence. The Chicago newspapers, reveling in their righteous anger, would not leave them in peace. Reporters with cameras hid in the woods, trying to capture a shot of their life in sin. In their articles, they called Taliesin nothing less than a nest of immorality, a love castle built on the ruins of two families. Every word was a stone thrown at their windows. The local residents, farmers from Spring Green, looked at the house on the hill with a mixture of fear and hatred. To them, people of simple rules and calloused hands, the inhabitants of Taliesin were outsiders, strange, arrogant people from the big city who had broken the ultimate law, the law of God and man. When their wagons passed by, they would not look toward the house, as if afraid of being infected by sin. Their silence was louder than any curse. Their gazes, heavy and condemning, bored into her back whenever Mamah went into town for groceries. Every scene of their idyllic life was poisoned by this tension. There they are, sitting on the terrace, drinking tea and watching the sun set behind the hills. But the silence is broken by the crack of a twig in the woods. Is it just a deer? Or another reporter? There is Wright, working in his studio, but a knock at the door makes him flinch. Is it a client? Or a process server with a summons from his abandoned wife? They had built their paradise of stone, wood, and genius. But this paradise was surrounded by an invisible wall of hell, built from public condemnation. The house that was meant to be a symbol of their freedom became their only defense. It was their armor, their manifesto, and their prison. They could only be free here, within these walls, in this love nest that the world saw burning in the fire of condemnation long before the real flames ever touched it. August 15th, 1914. Noon. Wisconsin was melting under the weight of the summer heat. The air was still, thick as molasses. Even the birds were silent, numbed by the heat. It was one of those days when it seems nothing can happen. That time itself has fallen asleep. Frank Lloyd Wright was far away in Chicago. He was finishing his work on the Midway Gardens project, a project both grandiose and doomed. He had left, leaving his Eden under the watch of the sun and the sleepy silence. At Taliesin, life went on as usual. Mamah Cheney sat on the veranda with her children, 11-year-old John and 8-year-old Martha. They were waiting for lunch. With them were draftsmen, workers, a small commune that revolved around the genius and his muse. A normal day, a normal lunch. The servant, Julian Carlton, was serving the food. A man from Barbados, quiet, efficient. A few weeks earlier, he had placed an ad in the newspaper. Work wanted, colored. He was hired. He moved through the house silently, his face an impenetrable mask. No one noticed anything strange in his eyes. No one heard the clock ticking in his head. They sat down at the table in the dining room, the very one with windows overlooking the valley, the very one that was the heart of the home. Carlton served them soup. Then he walked out, calmly, without a fuss. He went to the dining room door and locked it from the outside. He walked around the house, methodically locking the other exits. The house fortress, the house sanctuary, had in an instant become a trap. He had hidden a bucket of gasoline under the porch. He took it and slowly, as if performing a ritual, doused the wooden walls beneath the dining room. He splashed gasoline on the door, and then he struck a match. The wood, dried by years of summer sun, ignited instantly. The flame latched onto the flesh of the house with a greedy roar. Inside the dining room, the first few seconds were filled with bewilderment, the smell of smoke, a scream, realization. They rushed to the doors, locked. They beat against them, but the wood and iron held fast. The fire was already licking the floor. Smoke, black and acrid, filled their lungs, burning the screams from within. Panic turned into animal terror. The only way to escape was through the windows. They smashed the glass and began to jump out, falling onto the grass, coughing, blinded by the sun and smoke. They thought they were safe. But down below, Julian Carlton was waiting for them. In his hands was a wood-splitting axe, the very one he used to chop logs for the 37 fireplaces in this house. He was waiting for them, calmly, methodically, like a reaper going out to harvest. The first to jump was the draftsman, Emile Brodel, a blow from the axe. The second, the carpenter, Thomas Brunker, another blow. Blood splattered on the yellow limestone, on the grass, on the killer's white shirt. Screams of horror mingled with the roar of the fire. Mamah Cheney jumped from the window, trying to lead her children away. But he was there. He caught up with her. The silhouette of a man with an axe against the backdrop of the burning house, against the backdrop of her dream, her paradise, which had turned into hell. 7 people, Mamah, her 2 children, a draftsman, a carpenter, a gardener, the foreman's son, a 13-year-old boy. 7 lives, cut short at the peak of a hot, sleepy day. In Chicago, Wright was handed a telegram, a few dry, terse words. Taliesin destroyed by fire. Mamah Cheney and children are dead. His world collapsed. His Eden, his challenge to society, his shining brow. All had turned to a pile of ashes, drenched in blood and soaked with the smell of burnt human flesh. The architect, who had imagined himself a god, saw his universe destroyed by a single quiet servant with an axe in his hand. The dream had turned into a slaughter, and that fire would burn in his eyes for the rest of his days. He stood on the ruins. A week ago, this was a living room where music played. Now, black, charred beams stuck out of the ground like the ribs of a dead animal. The air still smelled of fire, a bitter, acrid smell, mixed with a sweetish, cadaverous stench that was impossible to get rid of. Every stone he touched was warm, as if it held the memory of the flames. Any other man would have been broken, crushed, would have seen this as divine punishment, a terrible, bloody verdict on his pride. But Frank Lloyd Wright was made of different stuff, of the same stubborn, unyielding stone from which he built his houses. In his grief, there was no submission. There was rage, defiance. He didn't let the ashes cool. He gathered the surviving workers and gave the order: rebuild, not restore, not copy. Build Taliesin II. He walked through the ashes, pointing out where the new walls would be. He designed right on the spot, drawing plans with a stick on the scorched earth. This wasn't architecture. It was an act of pure, insane defiance. He was screaming at fate, at God, at the whole world. You cannot destroy me. I will build again. I will build better. And he built. Taliesin II rose on the bones of the first. It resembled its predecessor, but it was different, more enclosed, more somber. There was less lightness in its lines, more tragedy. The living quarters, where Mamah had died, he left as ruins, a memorial. But it was not a monument to grief. It was a monument to his stubbornness. He walled the tragedy in stone, to face it every single day. The money flowed. The fee for the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, a project nearly 10 years in the making, allowed him to pay the bills. It seemed he had won. The phoenix had risen from the ashes, but fate wasn't finished with him yet. Or perhaps the house itself, born in sin and washed in blood, did not want a quiet life. April 1925. Night. A thunderstorm. Wright woke to a crackling sound, but it wasn't thunder. It was the crackle of fire. Again. The flame, this time born not of hatred, but of chance. Faulty telephone wiring. But it was just as ruthless. The fire devoured Taliesin II with the same hungry fury as the first. It destroyed what the killer's axe had spared. The priceless collection of Japanese prints, his shadow capital, his one true passion besides architecture, was reduced to a handful of black ash. He barely escaped himself, running out into the night, and watched helplessly as his world burned. For the second time, twice born, twice burned. This time the blow was not only emotional, but financial. The money ran out. The collection that was his insurance policy was gone. The banks, which already viewed him with suspicion, slammed their doors shut. He was a genius whose name thundered across the world, but he didn't have a cent in his pocket. And then came the final, most humiliating blow. The Bank of Wisconsin, to which he had mortgaged the estate, sent a notice. Dry, merciless words on official paper. The house and all the land were foreclosed on for debts. He was evicted, the architect of his own Eden, twice built, twice lost. Now he was homeless, an exile from his own, twice created paradise. He stood at the gates of his estate, now padlocked, and looked at the blackened walls. This wasn't just financial ruin. It was complete, absolute defeat. He was at rock bottom, and it seemed that this time the stones of the debtor's pit would become his tomb. At the bottom of a pit of debt, in the silence of humiliation, either monsters or brilliant ideas are born. Wright's idea was both. It was a plan for salvation, cynical and brilliant in its simplicity. If the world wouldn't give him money to maintain his dream, he would make the world pay for the privilege of building that dream for him. 1932. America was writhing in the convulsions of the Great Depression. Architects were out of work, great firms were closing, draftsmen were sweeping streets. There was no hope. And at that moment, Wright, exiled from his own paradise, sounded a call. He announced the founding of the Taliesin Fellowship. This wasn't just a school. It was a calling. He wasn't summoning students, but acolytes. He promised them not a diploma, but an initiation into a mystery, the opportunity to live and work side by side with the greatest architect of the age. And for this, they had to pay. We see them arriving, young people with fire in their eyes, graduates of the best universities, whose diplomas had become useless paper. They come to Wisconsin, bringing with them their family's last savings, $650 a year, a huge sum for the time. They were paying for the right to work. Their reality turned out to be far from their romantic dreams. Taliesin, bought back from the bank with money from friends and former clients, was still in a state of semi-ruin. The work didn't begin at drafting tables. It began in the cowshed, up at 6 in the morning, milking cows, working in the fields, under the scorching sun or in the freezing rain. They planted potatoes, chopped wood, hauled stones for new walls. Their delicate hands, accustomed to pencil and T-square, became covered in calluses. They were not students. They were serfs in the master's feudal domain. Breakfast, simple food, grown on this very land. Then, a few hours in the studio. And here, Wright was a merciless dictator. He would walk past their tables, casting annihilating glances at their drawings. With a single stroke of his pencil, he could cross out weeks of painstaking work, muttering, "This isn't architecture. It's sentimental rubbish." He didn't teach. He forced them to guess, to catch his thoughts, to copy his style, to dissolve their own individuality in his genius. And then, back to work. Construction. Repairing the endlessly leaking roofs, preparing food for the entire commune. They were architects, builders, farmers, and servants all at once, and reigning over it all was she, Olgivanna, Wright's third wife, a student of the mystic Gurdjieff, a woman with an iron will and a gaze that pierced the soul. She was not merely the mistress of the house. She was the spiritual mentor of this strange sect. She introduced mandatory musical evenings, esoteric sacred dance practices, a strict dress code. She controlled their personal lives, their thoughts, their emotions. Wright built walls. She built an invisible prison for their souls. Taliesin was reborn, for the third time. But it was no longer the same house, not a love nest, not a monument to stubbornness. It had become a hybrid of a monastery, a commune, and a labor camp. It grew and was rebuilt on the free, almost slave-like labor of enraptured young men. Every new stone in its walls was paid for with their sweat, their money, their unfulfilled ambitions. The house was saved. It came alive again, filled with voices, work, music. But the price of this salvation was high. To preserve his creation, the architect sold something more than just principles. He sold the souls of those who came to him to learn freedom. And Taliesin, once a temple to genius, became a monument to his boundless, all-consuming ego. Death came for him at 91. Quietly, in a hospital room, far from the hills, he considered his own flesh. The Titan was gone, but the building remained, and in the deafening silence that followed his departure, Taliesin was, for the first time, left alone with time. Without its creator, without his ferocious will that bound the stones better than any mortar, the house began to slowly die. It became an orphan. The roofs, which had leaked even when the master was alive, now turned into sieves. The wood he so loved for its honesty began to rot. The paint peeled. The vast, complex organism, which had required the constant intervention of its demiurge, began to fall apart. The fellowship continued to exist under Olgivanna's iron hand. She turned her husband's legacy into a cult, and Taliesin into his mausoleum. But there wasn't enough money. To patch the holes, the foundation Wright had established began to sell off what he had collected his entire life. Archives, sketches, priceless Japanese prints that had survived the second fire. It all went under the hammer. The soul of the house was sold off, piece by piece, to preserve its aging body. The years went by. The house decayed. The struggle for funding became a humiliating routine. The great creation of a genius became a burden. And so, here we are again. In our time. In the cold, orderly present. With the same group of tourists shuffling along the gravel paths. But now, we see it all differently. We know that the money for this stone was taken from a deceived husband. We know that this lawn was soaked with the blood of 7 people, including 2 children. We know that this wall was built by the hands of a young man who paid for the privilege of being a slave here. We know that behind the radiance of genius hides the darkness of egoism, manipulation, and ruthlessness. And what became of this place, born of passion and tragedy? In 2019, Taliesin received the highest recognition. It was added to the UNESCO World Heritage List. The world, which had once scorned it as an immoral nest, now bowed its head before its architectural grandeur. It survived. It won. But at what cost? The price of this survival is sterility. The living, breathing, ever-changing organism that was a battlefield, a laboratory, and a temple has been transformed into a museum. Now you can't touch anything. You can't make noise. You cannot live. You can only walk along the designated paths and listen to the guide's polished narrative. Final shot. The house at sunset. The sun paints the yellow limestone the color of old gold. It is as beautiful as ever. It is still rooted in its hill. But it is empty. Of the ambition, love, blood, and madness that once seethed within these walls, nothing remains but stories. Stories that are now packaged into tourist brochures. And the stones, the very stones that remember fire and the axe, are now sold in the gift shop as polished paperweights. And silence, a deep, museum-like silence, time's final and absolute verdict. So, what is Taliesin? It is not just a house, but the biography of its creator frozen in stone, where every elegant line is inseparable from an ugly scar left by life. A temple of egoism that became a tombstone for love, ultimately transformed into a flawless but soulless museum piece. Do we have the right, while admiring the shining facade of a genius, to forget the darkness that lies in his foundation? And what is more frightening, the creator willing to do anything for his vision, or us, willing to forgive him anything for the sake of beauty? This debate about the price of genius has no single answer, and that is precisely why it is so important. Share your opinion in the comments, because the true life of great creations lies in this very dialogue. And to avoid missing our next explorations on the edge of light and darkness, subscribe to the channel and support our work.